If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brü Lab. A few weeks ago, I celebrated a major milestone in my journey to learn as much as possible about beer and brewing. I completed my master's degree. I'm your host, Cade Jobe, and today in the lab, my guest is, well, me. As many of you know, I've been studying brewing science at Oregon State University under the mentorship of Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and on July 25th of this year, 2024, I successfully defended my master's thesis. It was, of course, on a brewing-related topic and a subject that's been important for brewers making pale ales and IPAs, which are valued for their hoppy aroma and flavor. Beers that add loads of hops at or near the end of fermentation to preserve that hoppy aroma come with additional challenges from a phenomenon known as hop creep. Hop creep causes over-attenuation, increased alcohol and CO2, and potentially diacetyl issues. So Tom and I wanted to look at grower-side factors to understand how terroir and harvest maturity impact hop creep, and that's the study that I looked at. Those are the two studies that I looked at during my master's thesis defense. It's a culmination of a little over 2 years of work, and I'm excited to share for this episode the audio from the public portion of my defense. So hopefully you find it interesting. Again, we'll look at terroir and harvest maturity and how that impacts hop creep, and there's also a brief discussion at the beginning talking about what hop creep is and why we care about it. So hopefully this is something that you'll find interesting. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brülosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brülosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Becoming a patron is easy. Once you've contributed at that $3 level or higher, you get access to the private Patreon Facebook page where all of the previous Q&A sessions are available to watch, which I think, if I did my math correctly, is over 150 individual QA sessions with industry greats. Can you find a better value for $3 per month? Well, yes, you can. It's all of the other amazing brewing content that's available through Brülosophy, the website, the YouTube channel, this podcast, and the OG podcast, the Brülosophy podcast. Spare a few bucks and help us keep all of this free content going. All the information that you need to get access to this awesome resource is available at patreon.com/Brülosophy. So go check it out. All right, feedback this week is from listener David, who says, I'm making a hop water and was able to set up a homebrew gas hopper in about an hour and a half. The tube is just thin enough for the fridge to close, so I'm hoping it manages to create enough of a temperature differential for this to work. I'll let you guys know how this one pans out. That's pretty cool. So hearing from David that he's tried the gas hopper, and of course, 2 weeks later, he sent an update. He said, after 2 weeks of trying a lo-fi approach of boiling half the hopside water to keep it around 50 Celsius, I've concluded that doesn't work. He says, I'm going to buy a warming sleeve and try it again with better temperature control at 60 Celsius. I also am curious if I'm not purging well enough. So David is currently trying out the gas hopper in a hop water, which is pretty interesting application. I'd be interested to see how that's going to work. And of course, David, thanks for sending this in. Yeah, it seems like that lo-fi boiling half and then letting it sit didn't work. And yeah, I'm kind of wondering if around 50 Celsius is too low to volatilize most of those aromas sufficiently, or at least you might have to, continue that temperature differential for a lot longer at that temperature. But again, I don't know enough to be sure, but yeah, maybe if you can get it up to 60 Celsius, and yeah, let me know what happens when you get that warming sleeve. Another thing you could also try doing is setting the keg inside of a kettle with a recirculation pump and an electric heat stick set to 60 Celsius. That might work. That might also, it just keeps the liquid around the keg around 60 Celsius and would heat up and transfer that temperature inside to the keg. So yeah, maybe that could also help instead of a warming sleeve. is finding a way to put that keg inside of a brewing kettle. Anyway, I'm interested to see how this goes, and let me know. And yeah, thanks for trying out the gas hopper at a homebrew level. Please let us know how it goes. All right, after the break, I'll have the audio from my public thesis defense exploring how terroir and harvest maturity impact hop creep. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
Hop creep is a phenomenon experienced by brewers whereby enzymes from hops liberate fermentable sugars from residual dextrins that survive the mash, boil, and fermentation. In the presence of yeast, these sugars are fermented, producing extra alcohol and CO2 and possibly diacetyl as well. And without a kill step like pasteurization or filtration, the enzymes keep liberating sugars and the yeast keeps fermenting them, causing major problems for brewers. So what factors influence this phenomenon? Are there things that growers can do in the field to influence hop creep? And it turns out that there are. This was the subject of my master's thesis, and without further ado, let's get into the audio from my public presentation of my master's thesis.
All right, we're here for Cade Jobe's master's defense. We're here for like whatever your planning meeting, not a faculty meeting. Cade came to OSU in fall of 2021?
Winter 2021.
Winter,
yep.
2021, right. It's like that COVID blur, right? So he came here with a really unique background. He's got a BA in business?
Yeah,
BA and then a JD from UT Austin and then SMU. So he spent 7 years as a family practice attorney and nothing in the sciences, and then realized that he needed to take a change of course, fell in love with brewing, and he's just become a scientist, and he's doing a great job at it. He came here in 2021, and started working in a lab as like one of the lab assistants, and then in spring of 2022, we pulled him in as a master's student, and very quickly got immersed in all the activities that are going on. He's been working on help with the regional identity project, the Terroir project, and working a lot on this hop enzyme. That's what his master's thesis is about, and he's now working on hop smoke, like wildfire smoke, and its effect on hops. He'll continue on with the PhD. So today is more like a check-in than like a conclusion of one part of your work. It's not like there's no advice after this, so it's more like, right, here we go. So anyway, he's got a fun story to talk to you about with hop enzymes.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I'm excited for that introduction, so thank you all. My name is Cade. I think you all know me. I recognize all the faces in here, so that's a good thing. As Tom mentioned, when I came into the lab back in 2021, I didn't have a lot of technical expertise in science. I didn't have a lot of practical aspect. And they were in the middle of this project that we refer to as the Terroir project, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And questions started arising about hop creep. And so, well, one of the things that we'll talk about today, what is hop creep? Why do brewers care about that? But questions started arising about hop creep, factors that influence it, and it became a very natural extension to add this onto the Terroir project, focus exclusively on hop enzymes. Then we also had a maturity project that was going, and looking at how hops harvested at different times have different quality aspects and different quality components. And so we also added enzymes onto that too. And so that became my master's thesis, looking specifically at the dextrin-reducing enzyme activity of hops. So first of all, why do we care about hop creep? Why do we care about dextrin-reducing enzyme activity? Well, if you go into a grocery store, it looks a lot like this, right? There's IPAs everywhere. IPA, all over the place. IPAs are the #1 craft beer style in the United States right now, and they've seen an explosion over the last 10 or 15 years in popularity. They still, in terms of sales, don't beat the light lager guys, but IPAs are hugely popular for craft beer drinkers, and that's a big segment of the beer consumption market. IPAs largely get their hoppy aroma, which is what they're prized for, by this process called dry hopping. So dry hopping is when hops are added at or near the end of fermentation. When you add hops into the beer, a hop creep effect is observed. What is hop creep? This is what a typical fermentation curve looks like. So on the y-axis over here, you have gravity. This is the amount of extract that's present in the wort. At the start of fermentation, the extract is very high. Yeast consumes the fermentable sugars, produces alcohol and CO2, and makes the beverage that we call beer. Right? Around day 3 or day 4, the yeast is done fermenting the fermentable sugars. However, there is a pretty sizable portion of unfermentable residual wort extract, which is made up of dextrins, which are longer chain oligosaccharides, and also some other organic materials. These unfermentable unfermentable wort extracts is just kind of sitting there. Yeast aren't able to use it. But when you add a dry hop addition at or near the end of fermentation, we see this phenomenon, which is where the gravity actually starts to decrease. And if we were looking also at alcohol and CO2, we would see those increase, which means that fermentable sugars are being liberated from those dextrins. That's resulting in additional fermentation that's happening. So additional alcohol, additional CO2. These are potentially problematic for brewers, although it has been referred to as well as the freshening power of hops, because additional alcohol can produce a drying effect, also reducing the body of the beer by reducing those residual extracts. So sometimes brewers actually prefer these things. But occasionally brewers need that mouthfeel or that body to balance out the alcohol and bitterness from the hops. So you've got a huge load of hops in there. You need some malt backbone and body and stability in order to have a nice beverage that people like to drink. So that's why brewers have started to colloquially refer to this as hop creep. Unmitigated, hop creep can continue as long as there are dextrins that are capable of being hydrolyzed and enzymes and yeast that's capable of consuming those. This phenomenon we can see as long as it's been measured up to as much as 7 weeks at the end of fermentation, which is around 40 days post-fermentation. That's quite a while that this can happen. So again, this is what we refer to as hop creep. This is largely a product of how brewers make wort, or at least modern wort production methods. So we take grains, ground up malted barley, and then they add water to it, generally at a specified temperature. And then that results in the enzymes that are present in barley hydrolyze those starches and produce fermentable extract and quite a bit of unfermentable extract. Of course, the goal for most brewers is to maximize that fermentable extract that maximizes alcohol, and that's ultimately one of the key components that we're looking at in terms of beers, ABV and alcohol. So this fermentable extract gives the yeast the nutrients that it needs to make flavor active molecules and alcohol and CO2, which are necessary components for beer. But there is this unfermentable extract portion, and a sizable percentage of that, as much as 20% of the wort that's left after mashing, are dextrins. So how does this happen? Where do the dextrins come from? Well, as I mentioned, malted barley has enzymes endogenous to the malted barley that are capable of liberating fermentable sugars from amylose and amylopectin, which are the primary starch molecules in malted barley. So this is an image of what, it's a sort of a snapshot image of what an amylose chain or an amylopectin molecule would look like. The two primary enzymes that barley uses are alpha amylase and beta amylase, and they work a little bit differently. So alpha amylase sort of acts, it's an endogenous enzyme, so it acts inside of the chain. It doesn't act at the ends, and it kind of acts randomly, or let's say haphazardly. It's not repeatable or periodic. It sort of attaches and then it liberates sugars. It can do chains as low as 1 all the way up to as many as potentially 8 or 10 glucose molecules that are chained together. Beta amylase acts a little bit differently. So beta amylase attaches to the reducing end of amylose and then snips off 2 glucose units, which is maltose, right? Malted barley, maltose, that's the primary sugar in beer. Beta amylase, again, makes these maltose chains, and that's the fermentable sugar. So these two enzymes sort of work together. Maltose is the primary sugar in beer, so that's the main component in wort through beta amylase activity. Amylase snips through and makes other chains. It can make maltose, it can make maltotriose, it can make glucose, it can also make longer chain dextrins. And then, of course, we have this branched linkage here, this alpha-1,6 branch linkage, which makes it amylopectin. Right. Neither of the amylase works on this branched linkage. It doesn't have a high affinity. It doesn't work on the alpha 1 to 6 linkages, so it can't break these off. So the result in beer, as a result of modern wort production, is that we have a lot of dextrins and branched, let's say, glucose molecules that aren't capable of fermentation, aren't capable of ready fermentation by the wort. Now, you might think, well, if beta amylase could attach to the reducing ends of these sugars, why isn't beta amylase chopping up the 4s and the 5s and the 6s and the chains like that? Well, that's largely a function, again, of how brewers are producing wort. The temperature that beta amylase is active is lower than alpha amylase, and so brewers are typically raising temperature throughout mashing. And what that does is it denatures the beta amylase before the alpha amylase, which means even if the alpha amylase is still working and making chains of 6 or 8 or something like that, there's still a lot of those chains that are left that beta amylase can't actively hydrolyze. Now, why does this matter for hops? Right? This is starch biochemistry. This is the mash. Well, recent research from Matt Cottrell has shown that hops actually contain DNA that codes for amylase enzymes. This was really recent. This was in 2022 that this was discovered. So hops have the DNA that's capable of making those enzymes that can hydrolyze those sugars. So when hops are added to a beer that contains residual dextrins, those enzymes that were previously denatured are added and can now produce the hop creep effect that we see in beer. So we were interested in measuring this and looking at factors that influence it. So our primary assay that we use to measure hop creep is essentially a dry hopping assay. We take a beer and we add hops to it. We also add an antimicrobial agent, sodium azide, to make sure that the yeast isn't consuming any of the sugars that we liberate, and also to make sure there's no other bacteria or other microbes that are present on the hops that are consuming sugars or liberating sugars. And then we measure the amount of sugars that are released. So we measure maltose and glucose primarily. That's what we most care about, because those are the sugars that are easiest for brewers use to ferment. But we also look at fructose and maltotriose. We use HPLC to do that, as you can see here with a refractive index detector and a silver ion exchange column. This is what the chromatogram looks like in an unhopped beer. So each of these peaks is a glucose chain of the length that's specified here. The degree of preliminization is DP. So you have chains of 7 and lower down to maltose, glucose, and fructose. This is an unhopped based beer. When we add hops, it changes like this. We see an increase in maltose, glucose, and fructose, and a reduction in, I've got the reduction circled here in D3, in DP3 and 4. You can see it across the entire chromatogram. But it's easier to see on this graph. If I just sort of flip back and forth here, you can see it much easier, that there's a reduction in those dextrins. So we see an increase in sugars. That's how we measure hop creep potential, and that's sort of the main assay that I'll be talking about today as we go through. So again, I mentioned there were 2 projects that Tom's lab was doing whenever I got involved with the lab. One of them was terroir, so that's regional variation, and the other one was maturity, harvest timing. So what I wanted to ask was, how do changes in growing conditions affect hop creep? How does regional variation and how does harvest timing impact hop creep? So we'll start with the first study. What is terroir? Right? Terroir has also been described as regional identity, but it's essentially the interplay of climate, weather, soil, regionalized farm management practices, and how those impact the ultimate quality of the product that you're looking at. So for example, in wine, terroir is very, I think most people are familiar with terroir and wine, the creation of American viticultural areas. But this is a new and growing body of evidence in hops that terroir actually plays a role in chemistry. In fact, as part of the study that I'm talking about today, other researchers in Tom's lab showed that terroir does significantly impact the chemistry and sensory components of hops. So then that raises the question, what about hop creep and what about the biochemical components? So this research was published this year in the in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists. And what we did was we looked at 35 different fields from 22 independent growers across 2 states, Oregon and Washington, and across 2 harvest years, 2020 and 2021. Then we used our dry hop dextrin-reducing enzyme assay, and we compared those against 79 different terroir variables. So soil management, climate, and then hop chemistry characteristics. So why Washington and Oregon? Well, Washington and Oregon are 2 of the largest growing regions in the United States. 75% of the hops that are grown in the United States are grown in Washington, and let's say another between 10 and 15%, depending on the year, that's grown in Oregon. So we're looking at almost upwards of 85% of the hops grown in these 2 areas. Of course, Idaho being the 3rd one, in case you're curious. But the fields were all over these growing areas. So here you've got the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and there you've got the Yakima Valley in Washington. You can see that these farms were spread out all through those valleys and gave a representative sample of what it would be like to grow hops throughout that region. I wanted to put this up here, flash it up here so you can see some examples of the variables, the specific variables that we discussed. These are in the publication. I'd encourage you to go there. I don't want to derail the process by going through each of these in detail, but essentially we're looking at buckets like soil, field management, climate, chemistry, and also weather on there. Soil is things like what type of soil is it? Where is water available? How much water is available in the soil? Organic matter, what nutrients exist in the soil that the plant can use. And then from a farm perspective, are we adding fertilizers or pest control or disease pressure? What are they adding in that way? And then of course, climate. I think that one's more obvious, but looking at things like how many days can the hops grow? What's the difference in temperature between the highs and lows during the day? So these are examples of the variables. So let's get into the results. Now this is a pretty busy graph. And so let me break this down real quick, and then we'll go through and dig into the results. So again, here on the y-axis, you've got the maltose and glucose release. So that's measured from our dry hop dextrin-reducing enzyme assay. And then the graph is sort of broken out like this. So you've got Cascade over in green and Mosaic over in blue. Those are the 2 hop varieties that we looked at in this study. And then from there, you can break down from 2020 to 2021. So again, 2020, 2021, 2020, 2021, all the way across. And then it's split by Oregon and Washington. The first big takeaway that we can take away from this graph is the difference between Cascade and Mosaic. That was probably the most significant finding from this research, is that the hop enzyme, the dextrin-reducing enzyme activity varied mostly by variety. Cascade, and if we included this in our ANOVA, this would explain the most amount of the variety. This is a big finding. You can look at the averages. So for 2020 and 2021, Cascade is much higher than the averages for Mosaic. And we confirmed this statistically too, using an ANOVA looking at the variety differences. From here, though, I'm going to separate things out looking within the variety, because I think that makes the most sense from a terroir perspective. And that helps to sort of drill down in how does terroir influence hop creep potential. So again, big takeaway, variety matters a lot in terms of dextrin-reducing enzyme activity. Now, we also looked at state, year, and differences between the farms and a couple of the interaction terms. The first thing to notice is that there wasn't a significant difference in the hop creep potential by state or by harvest year. That's pretty interesting. It means that no differences between Washington and Oregon, and also no differences between 2020 and 2021 when you look at the varieties independently. You can see that here in this graph. So this is, again, on the y-axis, we've got our maltose and glucose, And here on the bottom, we've got individual farms split out between 2020 and 2021, and again, Oregon and Washington. But if you're looking here, there's no real big difference in the trends, right? There's no bubbles that we can put here and here to show that there were differences between Oregon and Washington. In fact, it's a pretty flat line across. This is for Cascade, and again, here we've got Mosaic. And Mosaic, of course, there was a little bit more variation, but we also still don't see any major differences between year and state, except potentially here, right? We start looking over here at Mosaic in Oregon. There may be an effect where 2021 was higher than 2020. We'll get into that in just a second. So what about farm-to-farm variation? This is a terroir issue, right? How do the individual farms vary from each other? And we found that these actually did matter. So the farms showed different hop creep potential. You can see that again here in this graph. Each individual dot is that measurement for that farm, right? So we did our dry hop assay, and those individual dots are it. So you can see that there's quite a bit of variation in the farms, but there are some farms that sort of stand alone to themselves, that have their own specific characteristics that either increase or decrease the specific hop creep potential of that variety at that farm. We also saw a state by year interaction. And so that's where I was talking about that mosaic in 2021. If you look at the graph, your eyes sort of start to see this trend, right? 2020 is higher than 2021 for the Cascades, but over here, 2021 was higher for the mosaics. Statistically, that didn't stand, and it's largely because of the variation. If you look, the means are overlapping quite a bit. There was a lot of variation in the data that we observed, and so those statistical trends by year didn't hold. It did, however, hold for the mosaic in 2020 and 2021. So we did see a year effect in this specific variety in that state in Oregon. But again, looking at the data over as a whole, no differences between state and year. There was another interaction that we saw, which was year by farm. So that's, again, I think most easily explained by this graph, where you can see that the farms varied over the year depending on, their hop creep potential. So for example, this farm here obviously saw a statistically significant difference, or maybe this one is a better example, right? 2020 being much higher than 2021. However, some farms were pretty consistent that had the same measured enzyme activity over the years. So this does sort of show that, okay, there is something here to this terroir idea. The farms are showing some variation. Maybe it's not big enough for a state by state issue, but maybe something that farmers are doing or that's local to their soil type or their local subregion is actually playing a role on hop enzyme activity. So we looked further into the specific attributes that might explain those differences in enzyme activity. So what you have here is a table of correlations. So you've got here the specific terroir variable that we looked at as compared against that dextrin-reducing enzyme activity. So here you've got the correlations that are listed. These were specific variables were sourced from other research that's been done that has shown that these played a role in either hop creep potential or in specific varieties or in terroir chemistry and sensory attributes. But what we see is kind of a mess. There's not anything that is really clearly driving the differences that we see on farm to farm. I could, for example, highlight this area. So we've got organic material and estimated nitrogen release. Organic material is a measure of the organic material that's in the soil, and estimated nitrogen release is the amount of nitrogen that it would be estimated to release over a year. Those are sort of nitrogen-based metrics. And so if we looked at Oregon in Cascade in 2020 and 2021, we'd see, a decent correlation. A 0.6 correlation is decent. I guess I should step back and explain. Correlations are essentially between -1 and 1. The closer the correlation is to 1, that means it's a positive correlation, which means as this variable increases, so too did hop creep. If it's closer to a -1, that means as this variable decreased, hop creep increased, right? It has the opposite relationship. So this is a reasonable correlation. It's not particularly strong. We kind of expect a correlation of 0.8 or higher to really be tightly correlated to the specific variable. But when we look over here at Washington, it's going in the opposite direction. And then in Washington in 2021, it's essentially zero, which means they're uncorrelated or don't have any relationship together. So we also have another measure of nitrogen. If we looked and said, okay, maybe nitrogen might have something to do with this, we have nitrogen fertilization, where farmers are either adding or are adding nitrogen. And we see a correlation in Oregon in 2021, but again, very low correlations for the other variables. So while we're able to show that there is a difference in farms that's related to terroir, the specific variables is much less muddy. I can highlight a couple of other, like the highest correlation that we saw, which was almost 1, a 0.96 correlation between diurnal flux and Oregon Cascades in 2021. Diurnal flux is the difference between the high and the low for the day. So that was a high correlation in that year. And then the highest negative correlation that we saw was phosphorus fertilization in Washington 2022. Interesting. We can kind of pick and choose things to look at here, but nothing really paints a big picture. So big takeaway from this study is that one of the main thing that influences hop creep is hop variety, at least from this study. Terroir does have an impact. Again, we saw significant differences between farms, but we don't know the specific variables that might influence that hop creep potential or the differences between the farms. The next study looking at hop maturity. So in this study, we harvested Citra hops over 3 hop years. And hops are a perennial plant, which means that they grow back every year, and they spend a large part of the year either in dormancy or in growth. And there's a very short maturation window. So all of the hops that are grown in the United States are picked within a 5-6 week period. For farmers, that's a big deal because it means that a lot of the year you're managing the plants, but then you've got to harvest it really quickly and really fast. And harvesting all the hops means that different varieties may mature at different times. And so this is a management issue for farmers. So one thing we wanted to be able to show to farmers is, okay, let's look at Citra. Let's take a deep dive on that and see if we can help you with your management schedules. So what we did was we grew Citra hops. We partnered with a grower who grows Citra hops in Yakima Valley, Washington, and we harvested the fields. In 2021 and 2022, we took 3 different fields and we harvested them at 7 weekly time points. So essentially 2 weeks on either side of this 5-week picking period to have 7 weekly time points. In 2020, the first year of the study where Tom and Lindsay started thinking about maturity as something that might influence hop creep, we also we picked 1 field. So what we have is 1 field that was harvested over 3 hop years, and then I'll also show you results from 2022 where we have within the same harvest year 3 different fields as we're going through this. So hop creep, how did maturity influence it? This is 1 field over 3 harvest years. Again, on the y-axis you've got maltose and glucose release. On the x-axis, you have 2 measures. So down at the bottom, that's the harvest date. That's what we're talking about, 7 weekly time points. So as harvest date increases, hop dextrin-reducing enzyme activity decreased. And it decreased pretty significantly, over 60% from day 0 all the way to the end of that picking window from day 42. So if you were looking at just minimizing hop creep as a grower, this would be great, awesome. If the only thing we cared about was hop creep, we could just wait and let the hops sit on the vine as long as they can, and then we don't have to deal with this hop creep issue, or at least we can significantly reduce it. However, that's not necessarily the best outcome for brewers or growers. So hops are valued not necessarily for hop creep, they're valued for aroma in IPAs and also for bitterness. So one thing that we could see very clearly from picking these hops is the color change that happens from early hops over to late hops, with these early hops looking green and vegetable-y, and then the brown ones looking burnt or desiccated, right? And so we started to say, like, okay, well, if we were just focusing in on hop creep, that probably doesn't tell the whole story because other things are happening with the hops while they're maturing on the vine. So we looked at a couple of the traditional hop chemistry measures. We've got total oil, alpha acids, and the hop storage index. Total oil is a measure of the oil content that is hydro-distilled from hops. The aroma compounds in IPAs and hops come from that essential oil compound or fraction. And so for a lot of brewers and hop growers, the total oil fraction is an important measure of the amount of compounds that might be present in the hops. What you can see is that increases with harvest date and then starts to decrease. The effect is more pronounced with alpha acids. Alpha acids are the bittering component of hops, and those increase and then start to really drop off after. But there's kind of this plateau area, let's say right in the middle of the typical harvesting window, where it either plateaus or reaches its peak and then drops off. Hop storage index was largely unchanged. And that's sort of an interesting head scratcher for us because it's tied to alpha acids. Hop storage index looks at the current ratio of alpha acids to their oxidized products. And so relatively unchanged means that as the alpha acids are increasing, so is their oxidized product, and then potentially some vice versa there as we get over. So that's kind of a head scratcher for us. Are the oxidized products changing, and what does that mean? But we see the same trends within the same harvest year across 3 different fields. I won't spend time going through this, just flash it up here to say that the results are the same, both dextrin-reducing activity and chemistry, when we look at either one field over 3 years or 3 fields in a single year. Now, Citra is primarily prized for its aroma capacity, so not necessarily its bittering or hop creep potential, but its aroma capacity. So we asked panelists to smell Citra hops and rate those. We use a method called CATA, which is check all that apply. Essentially, we give them a slate of attributes, which you see there at the top. We ask them to smell the hops and check whether they smell that attribute in the hop. This is a frequency table, and so if we looked here in this square right at the top, we would say that 9 out of the 25 panelists that we had in the study checked off resinous for the hop that was picked, for the Field 7 hop that was picked on August 18th. So we can look through the entire frequency table and start to see some trends. Or, for example, here, 24 out of 25 panelists thought that this was resinous. So that's a pretty good indicator that that particular sample had a strong resinous component. Some trends that we observe in this is kind of like that chart that I showed you at the front about the change in color. We see tropical, grassy, floral, celery, green pepper, these sort of green vegetable characteristics, melon, are higher earlier in the growing season, and then they start to drop off and then essentially become non-existent later in the hops. But we see the opposite trend with these stinky garlic, onion, sweaty, green onion characteristics that really start to increase as hops sit on the vine. So as the hops are turning brown, they're becoming stinky and garlicky. This is a big deal. If Citra is prized for its aroma characteristics, that means we can't let them sit here to avoid hop creep, right? Because they're going to be stinky and garlicky, and brewers aren't going to want to brew with them. But there is this nice window right here in the middle, at least in this 2022 across these fields, where fruity characteristics, resinous, and citrus characteristics are kind of at a high level, but the green vegetable characteristics are low, and also the late onion, garlic, and stinky characteristics haven't started to increase too much yet. So this is kind of this nice area right here, and that sort of matches where we were talking about in the chemistry components. Remember I showed you that there was sort of an increase and then a plateau, or an increase and then a decrease? That's kind of in this ideal Citra picking window around, in this case, September 8th to September 15th. They showed their highest aroma potential. So one big takeaway from this study is hop creep isn't everything, right? The best combination of chemical, biochemical, and sensory characteristics of Citra hops exists within sort of a tight window. We're talking about 1 week to harvest the most grown hop in the United States. That's a lot, and it's a lot of pressure on growers. While I wish I could have told growers, oh, don't worry about it, you can expand that window out a lot longer, unfortunately, that's not takeaway from this study. It seems like Citra, whenever it's ready, those aroma characteristics are going to exist for a very short time. So putting it all together, hop variety seems to be a very important factor as an indicator of enzyme potential. So we saw that in the difference between Cascade and Mosaic in the Terroir study. We're also able to show that, hop creep varies by farm. So Terroir seems to play some role in the differences in hop creep, but that causal relationship, which specific terroir variables influence hop creep, there's still a lot of question around that. I don't think we have clear answers from the study about which variables impact hop creep. And then finally, on the maturity study, harvesting later in the season definitely reduces hop creep, but you have increases in onion and garlic, and you have some chemical challenges that result from the hop as well. So big takeaway is, do growing conditions influence hop creep? And the answer to that is yes. It seems like both terroir and maturity do significantly influence hop creep. Now, of course, I've never actually seen a scientific research that said, okay, we're done, let's wrap this up, we solved all of the issues. And so there's a lot of open work that still is out there to do. For example, this looks at 3 varieties. We looked at Cascade, Mosaic, and Citra. Those are popular varieties in the United States, but there are a lot of other varieties out there, like, for example, Strata, or some new varieties that are being grown. And it would be very interesting to look at how does terroir and harvest maturity influence these specific other varieties. We also need to, it would be a good idea to look at, see if we can figure out what specific terroir variables are actually influencing this hop creep, the difference in hop creep, or the differences in chemical and sensorial characteristics that we've seen in other studies. And then from the sort of interaction between terroir and maturity. So how does maturity, are growers making different decisions based on their subclimate, their disease pressure, and all of those issues? And how does that influence then terroir? Could some of the variation that we saw in the data be because of maturity differences between the growers? That's something that could be explored further as we look into this a little bit more. And then finally, I've mentioned and focused on amylases because we have evidence that shows that hops have those amylases. There are other enzymes that are capable of dextrin hydrolysis, like limidextrinase, amyloglucosidase, that are present in barley in small amounts. And there's some evidence that's shown that those enzymes may also be present in hops, however, at very low levels. So there's a question, is amylase, or alpha and beta amylase, the only enzymes that are working? That doesn't necessarily influence our assay because we're just looking at what is released, right? What is the glucose and maltose that's released, not the specific enzymes that are doing the releasing. But that's an open question that I think hasn't been addressed yet. So there's a lot of open work and a lot of places that people can look at in this. But ultimately, I'm pretty satisfied to show that growing conditions do impact hop creep and hop enzyme activity. So of course, I wanted to thank Tom as my major advisor for helping with this, my lab mates, Ron, who's sitting here, Lindsay and Michael Fesher, who were both involved in the terroir and maturity projects, also Ashley for being the one that harvested all of those hops in Washington over those 7 weekly time periods. And then of course, our grower partners and undergraduate students that helped along the way with the analysis.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Thank you all for attending, and I'll take questions if you've got them.
Thanks, Cade.
Yeah.
For questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the processing of the hops post-harvest. So what, in both studies, sort of, it looked like maybe you handled the Citra hops just in the lab, but the other hops, were those pelleted? Was it consistent in processing from each farm? How'd that go?
Sure. Good question. So let me start with the Citra maturity one because I think that one's a little easier. The terroir one's a little more complicated, but the Citra maturity one. So again, they were harvested on the farm. Hops are actually dried on the farm, so they're green and wet whenever they're harvested. So the Ashley, who is our grower partner up there, harvested those by hand, ran them through a small scale picker, and then kilned them on the farm, vacuum sealed them in with an inert gas, nitrogen, and then froze them. And then essentially we just transport them down here where they sit in our freezer before they're processed. So it's kind of the easiest way. That one's an easy one. The terroir one was much more difficult because you've got 35 farms, 22 different growers, all who are doing something different. But that was a big emphasis for us with the study, was to make sure that we were being consistent about how it was processed. So all of the hops that were grown in Oregon were harvested by hand by myself, Ron, Michael, and some other students, and then transported to the alluvial farm, which is at Coleman Agriculture, where they were processed, dried, and then pelletized here at Oregon State. So they were dried at the commercial kiln and then processed here at Oregon State. Same process in Washington, just not by Oregon State students. So it was Peralt Farms was our grower partner. They harvested up there, dried them on their commercial scale kilns, pelletized them on their pelletizer, which actually is the same pelletizer that we have here, and then packaged those into foil packages, nitrogen, sealed them with an inert gas, and froze them. So, yeah, long-winded answer, but a very important one.
I have a question from the Zoom from Daniel Sharp.
Okay.
He just raised their hand. So.
Okay, Daniel, you want to ask?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go.
Cool. Hey, nice job. Really cool to see the results you got here. Following up on the processing question, I know previous work by Dr. Rubottom out of your guys' lab. What did you do to control for kiln temperature, as that might kind of impact some of the enzymatic activity? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So for kiln temperature, these hops were harvested at the same time that the particular variety was being kilned in the kiln. So and again, all in the same kiln. So the grower specified that temperature for either the Cascade or Mosaic. They have different temperatures. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what the exact temperature was, but
the nice alluvial farm was all, they killed all at the same temperature. They're all 135 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
So
say that's 135 or 140.
Yeah. It's just there were some different times because the hops might be sitting in that strata or that.
Were they? I thought they were all while Cascade was being picked, and I guess there might have been a little bit of overlap. That's true. Yeah. So to answer that question, Daniel, there might have been a little bit of overlap where the Cascade, where they were dried in different kilns. But yeah, for the most part, everything at alluvial is at the same temperature. So
everything
and Peralt
was the same temperature, which I think was 120.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for that question, Daniel.
Yeah. Can we go to your, like, one of the bar graphs?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. Just like as an example. Yeah. This one. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm assuming a bar represents a mean.
Yes.
Okay. How many reps did you do, and what kind of variability here?
That's a good question. So there were no reps between the different farms. So essentially each farm and each hop year was one rep. So
it's not a mean.
Well, it is. It's a technical average. So when we do the dry hopping enzyme assay, we actually do 2 reps of the assay. So from a treatment effect, there's not an individual rep here, but from the assay, we essentially do 2 technical reps where we dry hop to, and then so it's an average of that mean across 2 reps. But that's why we don't display error bars or anything here, because it's not a treatment rep. It's just that specific assay that we do a technical rep.
Did you do any replication of that? I'm just curious, like, what is the variability if you repeat your dry hopping? Like, is this meaningful difference between, say, 0.2 and 0.6?
Oh, yeah.
Or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, we do, and we look at that quite frequently. So again, we're doing 2 reps on each one, and then taking the average of that, and that's what's displayed here.
Well, no, I mean, if you did the same beer with the same hop 6 times.
Oh yeah, what's the variation in the assay? Yeah.
Not the assay, the dry hopping.
The dry hopping. Yes, yeah, we've looked at that. We always have a control in there with Total Dom, which is a beer that we were using at the time for dry hopping. Yeah, we've looked at that. The variation is pretty low. It's not very high. I don't have the specific like averages or variability off the top of my head, but the variation's not huge. But it can be. It's always within or less than 10% because we don't accept the average unless the variation between the 2 is within 10%. For the technical replicates, yes. Yeah.
Sort of related to that, are you harvesting from just like a single vine on farm, or are you sort of picking a couple spots and combining that?
Good question. Picking a couple spots and combining that in both studies, in the terroir assay and in the maturity. Yeah. that was important to make sure that we weren't just, getting, especially for the terroir study, because the soil especially can change across the fields. Even within the field, the soil can be totally different, which is
from the
challenging.
Regional identity study, they were within, I would say, like 5 meters of that soil.
Yes.
So like the field might be 5-acre field, but go out, soil scientist says, and the farm manager says, this is like the soil we're going to look at. So then we grab 15 vines, I think it was.
Yeah, it depended on the variety.
Vines.
I think it was more like 20 vines for Cascade and like 12 vines for Mosaic, because they're obviously very different cone morphologies.
But all within a short distance around that sample of the soil.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Matt as well.
Okay. Hey, Matt.
Howdy. Yeah, I want to follow up on the discussion of processing. So experimentally, you controlled for processing by doing the processing yourself rather than allowing the different farms to do the processing, which experimentally makes a lot of sense. Do you have an idea of how much variability there might be in the real world when different farms are processing their hops? How much variability that might add to differences in hop creep potential of the hops, and what would be the magnitude of that variability compared to the terroir variability that you saw?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. This is totally anecdotally. I don't have any obvious data to back this up. I would say there's wide variability. I would say especially there's wide variability in maturity decisions between farms. There's not a universal metric that growers use to determine when hops are ready to be harvested. They look at a bunch of different things. They look at dry matter, which you saw on some of those graphs. They look at what day it is. They look at temperature. They look at smoke, disease pressure, fungal pressure, all of these different characteristics. And of course, there is someone that's going out into the field, taking hops, crushing them, smelling them, and saying, okay, the aroma characteristics are where we want them. Let's harvest it. And that person is not the same person between each field or even each grower, right? So there's a wide variability in how growers process. And that was a key component for us to make sure that we were controlling that as best as we can. That is a big challenge with any terroir study, right? Is the differences that the growers are the differences between the growers, because everything is hyper-local, right? They're looking at their farm, at their field, trying to maximize yield and sales from their field. So they're making decisions based on what they see on the ground, and that can change. In fact, we had more fields than this in the study, either in 2020 or 2021. But some of those fields, for whatever reason, the grower either stopped planting or they harvested all the hops in the field before we could get out there. We get a phone call at 8 a.m., you're out there at 10 a.m. and the hops are gone. So that happens sometimes too. But what you saw here was the farms that were the same over the 2 years, so that we could make sure we had a nice tight study there. Does that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, Alyssa, you had
Yeah, I'll ask you a less technical question. So are there growers and brewers that are like capitalizing on these garlicky, sweaty onion notes for IPA production?
Yeah, totally. I think some people love those aromas and flavors. That's not to say, again, that garlicky flavors are bad in all situations. Some people like that, especially whenever you get into the, I'd say, like sort of late Cascade, not the really late ones, or Citra, I'm sorry. Sort of late Citra, they take on this really resinous, dank, weed-like characteristic, and that onion garlic component is a component of that, right? So I think it is a really important attribute for some growers. And interestingly, one of the reasons for the terroir study originally, I believe, Tom, is that a lot of growers, whenever they're going, or brewers, when they're going out and picking the fields which they want to buy hops from, they come back to the same field every single year. Like, this is the field I want. I don't want the field that's next door to it. I don't want the field that's down the road. I want this field. So that was sort of the impetus for the terroir study. And a lot of that could be, I like the onion garlic characteristics that I get from this field. So, yeah.
How long are the hop plants in production? Like, because they're perennial, right? So,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so how long do they stay?
Ooh, that's a good question. Sean, I might tag you a little bit to help on this answer.
Yeah, probably about 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was a Cascade sample from Washington 70s.
Yeah.
It was unusual, but it was neat. It was like one of the original plantings of the escape.
Right. There's a plugable yard that was more than 50 years old. Still in production.
Wow.
So it can go a long time, but typically about 10 years or so.
Yeah, and depending upon the whims of the market, like it can change. Idaho can change over a field within a year, but Oregon it takes about 3 years to get like a full crop. It's not quite like one grapes, but still. So in Idaho, you might see farmers changing their fields every 2 or 3 years. Like, oh, you want more citral? We'll plant more citral. You want more citral? We'll plant whatever you want. While in Oregon, it's a little more steady. So.
And do you think any of these would change as the plant ages?
That's
a great question.
The question that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Actually, the follow-on in some of this is like looking at viral disease mode. So some of the maturity stuff that Cade was talking about rolled into the farmers saying, hey, one of these fields is a virus-free field. And we expand the study to look at fields that we know were planted in the last 3 years that are virus-free versus ones that are virus-infected. That virus is going to be what is going to be a function. So you just slowly, and stop it. So that only do is virus.
Yeah, right.
Really nice work, Cade.
Thank you.
So when we think about the brewers and sort of the brewers and even consumers, the negative effects of hop creep, what do you think should be the path forward to look at how it affects the flavor of the IPA styles? And there's so many IPA styles that you can add to double IPA. Or is it the packaging issue or any dangers? So how would, because your work gives a lot of good insight to the source, like is there anything for next steps that's the most important to guide the brewers or even the consumers, flavor or packaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of work that's been done looking at the ways that the brewing process itself impacts the amount of hop creep that's done. I can give you a really easy example is the mash chemistry that we talked about. Just by changing the temperature of the mash, you can change the enzyme activities and change the amount of dextrin that survives into the beer. And so that's one really easy way. I don't know that there's a most important. I think brewers, and Daniel is on here. I see Campbell on as well. I'm sure they could, jump in too with what they're doing at their breweries. But the brewers have a lot of options and tools. They can use alpha-ketolactate decarboxylase enzyme, ALDC enzyme, which deals with the diacetyl component, which is a secondary flavor metabolite that's created from hop creep. They can add that enzyme to the fermentation and deal with those potential aspects. They can also just wait a little longer for terminal gravity to be reached. There's a lot of different things that brewers can do. But this is a conversation that's not just for brewers, right? It's not just how do brewers deal with the issue. It's what can growers also do to help mitigate these issues. And if we learn more about other varieties like Citra in terms of does hop creep follow the same curve? Does it continue to decrease as hops mature in all of those, in all varieties? Maybe the picking windows can help us decide, okay, maybe we should pick, for example, Strata. We can pick Strata earlier, and maybe we won't see as much dry hop potential if we used Strata instead of a different hop that we're currently using that has a high hop creep potential, for example. Yeah, lots of really cool stuff that brewers are doing, and brewers are awesome. They innovate all the time, so they're always coming up with new ways to deal with this. So.
There is lately has been a new trend of using fresh hops to do IPAs, without skipping all the validating and the killing that you mentioned. So, have you ever studied the hop creep of these fresh hops? Like, I'm expecting it to be higher because the killing maybe enzymes will survive and will be even stronger.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. We did a study last year where we looked at fresh hops versus kiln dried hops. We were focusing more on an oil component there. Like, does the oil bake off during kilning? We were thinking about like loss of aromatic compounds. I don't think we did enzyme assay for that, did we? Yeah, we should have.
Yeah. That leads to my next question then, because you see the trends in hops like with the dry matter decreasing, decreasing, the hop creep decrease too.
Mhm.
So meaning that the driest is the hop at picking, the lowest is the enzymatic activity after pelletizing. So the whole kilning process and everything.
Yeah.
So, is it something you were expecting, this result? Because for me, it's like the opposite way around in malt, if you think about it.
Right.
During the kilning of malt, we make sure that the first step of the kilning at low temperature to make sure to lower the moisture as low as possible before the curing. Otherwise, we will destroy most of the enzymes.
The enzymes.
You mentioned. Here it seems to be like the opposite way around.
Yeah, so there's a piece of this too that I didn't talk about today, but Lindsay Rubottom just got her PhD last year looking at the impact of kilning. And one of the papers that she published was specifically how does different kilning temperatures influence that, which I know you're familiar with. And so that kilning temperature does play a major role in enzyme activity. Question is what about the actual dry matter of the hop itself? And yeah, that's I don't know that it was necessarily surprising. I think it makes sense when you talk to plant physiologists. They sort of suggest that, yeah, as the plant is, dying, it doesn't need a starch accumulation source, or not dying, but maturing, right? It's beyond its maturation. It doesn't need as much of a starch source. It doesn't need to have as much of those enzymes to be able to access that because it just doesn't have the same energy requirements that it did earlier. So from a physiologist perspective, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, that's an interesting point about malting. Yeah, Dana?
A question about dry hopping and non-alcoholic beer. So does this mean that if you're making a non-alcoholic beer, you need to be particularly sensitive or attuned to this research to make sure your beer stays reliably non-alcoholic?
Non-alcoholic. That's a great question. Dry hopping is going to do a bunch of things to non-alcoholic beer. One of the main things from a stability standpoint is going to raise the pH, and it might raise the pH beyond a level where it would be safe for microbes to grow. There also might be microbes present on the dry hops themselves that you're then adding into a substrate that may have sugars, may even have fermentable sugars that haven't yet been fermented by yeast. So you could actually, by adding dry hops into a non-alcoholic beer, if you're not careful in the way that you make that non-alcoholic beer, could absolutely creep alcohol production, CO2 production, and potentially a health safety issue. In beer, we tend not to focus on microbial contamination because we have a lower pH, high alcohol, and those are generally, and CO2 concentration as well. Those conditions generally aren't favorable for most pathogenic microbes, so we don't necessarily consider those as much in beer. That's not to say that they're not an issue. It's just not as much of a concern, but non-alcoholic beers, definitely a concern and definitely something that brewers are interested in learning more about. Good question. Thank you. Yeah, everybody done? Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Well, there you go. That was the public portion of my master's thesis presentation. The closed door session also went well, and I did successfully defend my master's thesis. So I hope you enjoyed listening to that audio, and I hope you found it interesting how terroir and harvest maturity influence hop creep. Since I asked this question of all of my guests as I work to wrap up the show, I'll ask it to myself as well. If I had one thing I wanted brewers to take away from today's episode, what would it be? And thinking about this, I think variety matters a lot when it comes to hop creep, potentially more than terroir or even harvest maturity. The different varieties just creep differently. I think that's a really big deal. So Cascade creeps a lot more than Citra. There's a lot of other good research out there that has demonstrated this as well, that different varieties might creep differently. Strata, for example, is something that's really stable in terms of its hop creep. It doesn't really change very much with harvest maturity. So variety matters a lot. The specific hop that you use oftentimes might dictate your hop creep more than some of these other factors. But that's just a guess. We've never actually looked at, Caitlin Kirkpatrick back in 2018 looked at a variety of hops and showed that all of them crept to some extent. But yeah, there's differences in the magnitude of that creep. So I think that's my biggest takeaway from the show. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed listening to my master's thesis. You'll find a link to the actual written thesis in the show notes. Next week, if I can swing it, Dr. Tom Shellhammer and I will be here talking about the current state of research into hop creep. But if not, then of course Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this week's episode. Either way, see y'all then. The Brü Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brü Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.